Welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about the threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information on matters of public concern in our democracy, and dedicated to exploring solutions, both legal and otherwise, for preserving the press function. I'm RonNell Andersen-Jones. I'm joined by Scott Shapiro. Hi, Scott.
Hi, RonNell.
And by Sandra Barron. Hi, Sandy.
Hello, hello.
Today we'll be having a discussion with our own Jack Balkin, the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and First Amendment at Yale Law School, about his seminal work on information fiduciaries, and in particular about the role of social media companies in our information landscape. To situate this for our later viewers, at this moment that we're recording in late May 2020, President Donald Trump has really thrust the question into the public dialogue in a really big way. Earlier this week, Twitter rejected a plea from the widower of a woman whose death the president repeatedly mentioned in a series of tweets on a debunked conspiracy theory. And separately, Trump raged against Twitter for adding fact-checking labels to two Trump tweets that included misinformation about voter fraud and mail-in ballots. Twitter essentially suggested in a link to the president's 80 million followers that they click on that appended link for more accurate facts. In response to this, the president accused the company of stifling free speech, of engaging in censorship, of showing ongoing bias against conservatives, and of interfering with the upcoming elections. And he is now expected to roll out an executive order focused on Section 230, the statutory provision that grants broad immunity to social media companies and others for the content posted by their users. The administration is casting this as a good faith effort to protect free speech online. So this gives us the chance to think about social media and its role in the wider set of conversations that we've been having. Jack, I know we have lots of questions for you about the dynamics at play here and about the role that social media has in these broader conversations about the flow of accurate news and information in a democracy. But for starters, can we talk about our legal, constitutional, conceptual frameworks for free speech and press, and how you think social media companies fit within those? That is, do we best conceptualize them as speakers with their own free speech rights, as an editor or as a publisher, as something akin to a public square? What's the right way to situate them?
That's a great way of posing the question. So let me give you a bunch of different models, telecom models, for thinking about how we handle free speech and free press in the country. So one model is the model of a newspaper. Newspaper provides most of its own content, or it subscribes to content from other sources, and it edits it, and it takes great care in editing it. It accepts advertisements, but it also makes sure the advertisements are appropriate for it, and it publishes it. And under that model, the model of a newspaper, essentially they are fully protected First Amendment actors, and you can't edit or censor their editorial judgment, editorial discretion. That would be a violation of freedom of the press, as well as freedom of speech. Okay, so that's a newspaper model. Then we have the model of telephone companies. Telephone companies are basically designed to allow anybody to talk to anybody else. You call them on the phone, you can talk about whatever you want. Telephone company is treated as a common carrier, as a public utility, and they are not permitted to make any censoring, no editing. They just, all their basic job is to let people talk to each other. They're facilitating conversations with people. And they also, for reasons of economic reasons, they've been treated as public utilities where they have to provide universal service and reasonable rates and quality of service. So that's the second model of telecommunications. It's a common carriage public utility model. A third model would be a broadcaster. A broadcaster basically strikes a deal with the government. The government gives them access to an incredibly valuable resource, which is bandwidth, frequency and bandwidth. And in return, they take on public interest obligations, which are really rather modest, at least these days. But the idea is that it's a government bargain. This person is providing information for the public, and in return, we give you a valuable free resource, and then you take on public interest obligations, right? Another model is the government's own property, in which it makes a street or a park available for public discussion. And there are very significant restrictions on the kinds of content-based regulations governments can have in those spaces. But the government is permitted to engage in triage. That is, if more people than is convenient can use the property for that purpose, government can basically create a zoning system or a triage system or a first in line system called time, place, and manner regulations. So those are the existing models we have. And in these models, you see the business or government is playing a different role. In the telephone case, they just let things flow, just to facilitate communication. In the newspaper creates its own content and is trying to inform the public, and it exercises editorial judgment. In the case of the public forum, the government is basically supposed to create a space so people can communicate with each other, but it's not a model like telephones because it's not privately owned. And then finally, in the public interest model, basically the government is giving something to the company and it takes on public interest obligations in return. So what's going on with social media? Social media companies are like telephones to a certain extent because their basic purpose is to allow lots of people to communicate with each other and engage in public discussion and to send out information. But in fact, they're not, because in fact, the key thing they do, most important thing they do is moderate discussion. In fact, all social media that I know of, all of them that have gotten of any size have taken on moderating functions. And the reason is very simple, is that if you create a social media program, what will happen is you will get it will quickly become abused, and people will threaten each other and do terrible things to each other, and it'll be flooded with pornography, and it'll be flooded through all sorts of terrible things. And so people actually demand moderation as a key value of a social media company. It's also not like a newspaper because it doesn't produce its own content. Most of what it does is facilitate other people sending content to each other, right? So now we have to ask ourselves, what is its social function in the public sphere? That's really the central question. What I would say is that what social media companies are, is they have a new kind of social function that we really didn't have in the same way in the 20th century, but we now have in the age of the internet. Here's the social function. Their job is to curate, organize, and facilitate public conversation. That's their job. What they do is they make it easy for people to have conversations, they facilitate them, they organize them so that we can find other people who are interested in what we're interested in, and we can respond to them, right? And they curate them so that in fact the conversations can flow without people being worried about threats and being flooded with pornography and other kinds of things like that. They curate, they organize, they facilitate. That's their job. They don't primarily produce their own content. They're not like newspapers in that way. So when we think about what they should be doing, we should think about how they're doing this job of curating, organizing, and facilitating. Now this will lead to another point, which I think is very important and will come up again. It really doesn't matter if there are only a small number of telephone companies, because the telephone companies aren't really doing very much in the way of censoring or blocking anything. Their job is just let the conversations flow. But in the context of a social media company, because curation is one of their key things, the value that they add, they actually have to have a substantive view about what it means to organize discourse, what it means to facilitate discourse, what it means to curate discourse. So they're always going to have views that are not content neutral. They're going to have values and they're going to be promoting them through their terms of service. And because that's the case, it's a really bad idea if there's only one. It's a really bad idea. There should be many of them. And one of the problems we face today is there are only a small number of them. And because there are only a small number of them, people are very upset at them all the time. They're upset at them because their values don't necessarily reflect the values that they seek flowing out of these companies. But in some sense, these companies can't avoid having value choices. They have to. That's what's necessary for curation, for organization, facilitation. If Facebook didn't have a terms of service, if Twitter didn't have a terms of service, if they didn't moderate at all, the places would be completely anarchical. They would be ungovernable. No one would use them. And so the basic problem with social media is how to allow these to perform the social function without having them so dominate the structure of public discussion that basically people see it as unfair. That's the central problem.
In recent days, we've seen leadership of the two most prominent platforms, Facebook and Twitter, taking what seemed like starkly different positions on that question. Twitter adding this fact-checking function sort of not telling you, the user of Twitter, that it is false, but suggesting that you click here to get fuller information. And Mark Zuckerberg, in response to that, criticized Twitter for acting as what he called an arbiter of truth, that it was inappropriate, he thought, for social media platforms to engage in that process. Who's right about that, do you think? Or are neither right? Is it the case that we could choose various social media curation functions of our choosing?
Well, in a better world, we'd have lots and lots of different social media companies, and people could move to ones that they thought best respected their values about what public discourse should be like. I think that Zuckerberg's a little disingenuous, more than a little disingenuous, in saying that Facebook is not an arbiter of truth. There is a way to reinterpret his remarks that make it more sensible. But Facebook is an arbiter of truth in so many different ways. They have a very elaborate set of moderation policies. And in order to apply them, they actually have to know what's true and false. There are a whole number of different moderation policies where they have to be able to say this is true, this is false. They, for example, also, like Twitter, have said that they will take down postings that they think will undermine democratic processes of self-government. Like, for example, if you post something on Facebook that says, hey, the election is Wednesday, the election's on Tuesday. So in order to get people not to vote, Facebook will take that down. Well, they actually have to know when the election is, and they have to enforce a notion of truth in order to do that. So essentially what Zuckerberg is really saying, and that is, hey, Trump, don't regulate me, regulate Jack Dorsey, leave me alone. But it's also important to understand that if you think of what their social function is facilitating public discourse, they want to have a light touch. That is, they want to allow people to dispute and disagree about a whole bunch of things. And in that sense, Zuckerberg's right, they shouldn't be the arbiters of truth. But you can't actually do that function. You can't perform the function of curating and facilitating public discussion without basically taking a stand on a certain number of issues. And so that's what they have to do. They don't want people to think that they're doing that, because then people feel they're not neutral. They hate them for that, but they have to do it in order to do their jobs. That's why it's important that there be a lot of them and not just simply one global company that does it. Dorsey, it's ironic, by the way, that that Zuckerberg's saying that to Dorsey. Dorsey has always been the light touch guy. He has always been the last person in on a new form of moderation. Facebook has been so much more ahead of Twitter on this. And part of the reason is that Facebook's much larger and faces pressure from many, many more places in the world. And so if you look at Facebook's community standards, they go on for some time.
Yeah, so I want to open up the conversation to Sandy and Scott and see what other thoughts they have or what other questions they have for you about this interesting intersection between the role of social media companies and the free flow of information on matters of public concern, and particularly at this sort of heated moment where the president is suggesting that he'll intervene on the question of Section 230 on that piece of the puzzle. Sandy, do you have questions that you want to chime in with?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that I'm hearing, and that I think perhaps a number of people who watch this video cast may have, is at the end of the day, what levers of government does the president, with an executive order or with his executive powers, have to actually control what Twitter does? And I think I would ask you to sort of think about that both in the context of Twitter and in the context of what I think may be a somewhat different scenario, and that is Facebook. And I say that due to the size and scope, if nothing else, of Facebook. But take it away, Jack.
Well, the president has very few levers he can use. Most of them you're seeing right now, it's the bully pulpit, and I mean bully. Trump is acting like a bully, and he's just making random accusations, and he's abusing his power and authority, and he's generally acting in a terrible way. And part of what's going on with the executive order, which I've read and is just a hash, is that he's basically saying, hey, Twitter, you cross me, I cross you twice as much. I hit you back twice as much, so don't mess with me. Don't even think about fact-checking anything I say. And that's really his biggest power. His biggest power is just basically to get people enraged at the company. It's important to understand that both Twitter and Facebook have a doctrine, an internal policy that says that they will not apply their community service rules, their moderation rules, in the same way to important public figures. There are two reasons for this: the naughty reason and the nice reason. The nice reason is they think that people should know what public figures think so they can judge the quality of their actions and their motivations. The naughty reason is they're basically afraid of public figures. They think that they can hurt them in various ways, and they want to stay on good terms with them. So essentially, Trump has been allowed to violate Twitter's terms of service repeatedly, and Facebook's repeatedly. That is, if Trump were an ordinary person, but because he's treated as a public figure, he basically is given the power to harm and insinuate and spread conspiracy theories and do all sorts of things that ordinary people would not be allowed to do on the platform. And one way of understanding what this executive order about is, he's basically saying, and I want it to stay that way. I don't want you to treat me like an ordinary person and hold me to the same standards as everyone else. I want to be able to do whatever I want on your platform.
Jack, am I right, though, that the fear that Zuckerberg, you alluded to, that Zuckerberg has, comes not merely because of the threat of proposing an amendment to Section 230, which, for those who don't know what 230 is, it's a statute. It was enacted by Congress. Yeah. It can be amended by Congress, but it can't be amended by the president by fiat. On the other hand, I would think that Facebook's concerns are very different from Twitter's because of potential antitrust and other regulatory efforts that the president can initiate, and that you're going to be able to tell us more about than I probably can. But I think it's worth pointing out.
Right. There are lots of ways that the president can use the Justice Department to make life difficult for Facebook, and actually for Twitter too. The mere fact that they may or may not have violated the law doesn't mean that the president can't sick the Justice Department on them and basically enmesh them in years of litigation, which is extremely expensive. And even if they win, even if there's no case against them, they have spent enormous amounts of money. Nobody wants the Justice Department after them. So the president does have that power, and he's threatening to use it. But of course, he has to go through his Justice Department and get his Justice Department to do things. And there's always a sort of translational issue when the president orders that. It depends on how compliant, we might say, his Attorney General is. Well, that gets us on another subject altogether. But yes, you're right. Congress is at some point going to make changes to Section 230. We've already seen them make some changes in the last few years in an amendment about sex trafficking. But the real question is how much. And I think lots of folks, me included, I'm a big fan of Section 230, but I think there are minor adjustments that could be made to Section 230 that would make it fairer and more just. But the central reason why we have Section 230 is to make it possible for social media companies and other companies too, but social media companies especially, to play the role they have to play in the digital public sphere.
Yeah, Scott, you want to follow up on that? Did you have something to add?
Well, I don't have anything to add on that. I wanted to zoom out 30,000 feet, because both Jack and I have PhDs in philosophy. I wanted to ask the philosopher's question, which is that, so let's say you were the philosopher king and you could design the system in the way that you wanted to. And you wanted to design it in a way that would create an epistemological system that would produce the best information in a democracy. It seems like the current setup creates kind of perverse incentives. That is, the defamation law makes it such that the more moderation, the more curation, the more editorial input, the more careful you are in what you publish, the greater liability you have for for, let's say, defamatory speech or obscenity or the like. Whereas if you basically treat your website like if it, as they say, a platform, and you post stuff, then, well, you're just a platform, and so therefore you're not liable for the same sort of wrongs that would have been committed, that you would have been liable for if, let's say, you were the New York Times. So it's like you get punished for being more careful. And so the question is, all things considered, if you could design it on a blank slate, would you have something like Section 230?
Yeah, Section 230 was actually designed, well, there were many reasons for Section 230, but one of the reasons for Section 230 in hindsight is that it made it possible for you to be responsible about moderation. That is, you wouldn't get punished for trying to be responsible about moderation. Now, of course, Section 230 has been used for lots of other purposes, some of which are not at all good, and it's been used to wreak all sorts of injustices. But one of its advantages is it does that. Now, if you want to ask, how would I design this system now, it wouldn't be an ideal system. It would just be an outgrowth of what we currently have. My view would be, first, I would separate out the functions of content moderation and facilitation of public discourse from control over advertising networks and surveillance. Here's why. Facebook is not really a social media company. It's a surveillance company that does social media on the side. And Twitter, to a certain extent, is also a surveillance company that does social media on the side. And so when you look at the actual decisions that Facebook makes, you can see that all of its decisions make sense if you see it primarily as a surveillance company that sells data and uses that, not doesn't sell data, but sells access about its users to advertisers in order to reap super competitive profits. And so almost everything Zuckerberg does can be understood if you understand that he's the head of a surveillance company that controls a huge advertising network. That causes social media companies to do all sorts of bad things. It causes them to engage in polarization techniques. That is to say, to choose algorithms that will polarize audiences. It causes them to look the other way with respect to certain kinds of conspiracy theories. It causes them to produce moderation decisions or decisions in the algorithm of the feed that basically get people very upset and create all sorts of negative problems in society. And essentially, that's because it pays to do it that way. The business model is the basic problem. So if you want social media to perform their appropriate social function, the ones I just described, you have to change how they make money. You can't give them complete control over the advertising networks. Those have to be separate institutions. In other words, you have to engage. That's what antitrust should do. Separate out function, not just size. And you also, in fact, might require them to behave themselves with respect to how they collect and use end user data. That's related to the information fiduciary idea that I've been pushing. But you don't have to use my version of it, information fiduciaries. There are a whole bunch of other models of privacy regulation that you could use. The basic purpose is to prevent the abuse of end users when the collection of data. If you did those things and you also created sort of social media federalism, by which I mean lots and lots of different social media companies with slightly different affordances, doing slightly different things with slightly different moderation policies, then you would create a possibility for people to pick and choose which social media companies, more than one, they wanted to use. Social media companies would have an interest in competing to be useful to their end users in ways that they're often not useful to end users. And I think there would be fewer abuses. And you would serve democratic values better. That wouldn't be a perfect system. There would still be all sorts of problems, but it would be better than the system we currently have.
What do you take to be the main impediment to the formation of multiple social media companies? Obviously, there are multiple social media companies, but there's only one Twitter, there's only one Facebook, there's basically only one YouTube. What could you say that, look, it's in the nature of network effects that it's always going to, there's always going to be one, it's going to be a winner take all system? Or is there something about the way that the law and regulation are arranged that makes it artificially, creates artificial monopolies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So everybody has thought about the network effects problem, which is I want to be on Facebook because you're on Facebook, right? I want to be on Twitter because you're on Twitter. And so that tends to create a network effect where you get agglomeration around a small number of companies. There are ways around it, by the way. By the way, first of all, if you create lots of different affordances, so in other words, by affordance, I mean what your social media does. Does it provide video? Does it allow short films? Does it allow text? There are lots of different affordances. If you allow lots of different affordances, you get people will then join lots of different social media companies because they like the different affordances. But there's another thing you could do. You could basically require the companies to make their APIs available to lots of people so that people could build super feeds on top of the feeds of social media companies. So you may remember in the ancient days of the internet, you had things like news feeds that allowed you to basically subscribe to bunches of different blogs and newspapers and such. You could do the same thing with social media. Basically, you could have a super application that plugs into the APIs of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and and YouTube, and it would basically allow you to build your own social media system, right? And at that point, the network effects problem is not as great as it would be before. In fact, what it would do is we create all sorts of virtuous circles in terms of competitive effects for social media companies because they want to be in your subscription, all right? It would also have an effect on how the advertising models work. So the basic idea is that there is something about our law that is preventing it, and what is preventing it is the way in which we've done antitrust, trade secret law, and various other features of IP law that have impeded, and also the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, have impeded the ability to create these kinds of applications that would solve some of the network problem effects. Now, Ethan Zuckerman, who's about to start a new center at Amherst in Massachusetts, has been working on these problems for some time. And I think a lot of his proposals are really interesting, and we should try to do something along those lines. But Ethan himself will tell you, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, antitrust law, trade secret law, intellectual property law as they currently exist are impeding efforts to do this sort of thing.
It does seem, and then I'll hand it over, but it does seem like as so many of hot button topics are these days, it's really a systemic problem. It's not like what do we do about the orange president saying bad things that we don't like, but it's really rather how do we deal with media concentration? How do we deal with the rights of technology companies to control their APIs and the like? That's what I'm hearing you saying.
Yeah. And here's a point, Julie Cohn has made this point, and I totally agree with her. I've made a point too. To vary Bill Clinton's famous saying, it's the business model, stupid. If the business models are central to what ails social media. People are fighting over questions of content moderation, but what they really should be boring down on are the question of how these companies make their money. What are the incentives that the particular system of surveillance capitalism is giving them? How can we give them different incentives so that to align their incentives better with the public interest? Those, to me, are the central questions.
Jack, what are the risks, if any, the problems, if any, that are created by the fact that we have these broad, systemic, long-term, overarching sets of problems at the intersection of law and economics and business development models that really need to be tussled through, that you and others have been describing the need for reform and careful thought about for a really long time. And now we're thrust into this space because the president has become upset about something, and we've sort of galvanized a conversation about it in a very political space, in a space that has now, I mean, we hear that sort of employees at Twitter are receiving millions of messages from followers of Trump who are upset with them, who are lobbing accusations about censorship and free speech rights. How does that muddle the conversation? Are you concerned that the kind of careful, thoughtful, systemic reform, careful conversations about what neutrality looks like and how not to discourage people from moderating, entities from moderating content, and how to continue to promote innovation online, that those conversations will not happen in the ways that would be most ideal given the circumstances that have triggered the investigations of reform?
I am worried, but you have to work with the democracy you have, not the democracy you wish you had. If I can make an historical analogy, one that I make many times so people are tired of me making it. People understood there was something wrong with the American economy by the 1870s or 1880s. This is right straight in the middle of the Gilded Age, and we're in the second Gilded Age now. Essentially, politics is highly polarized between the two parties, and both parties in some ways are captured by the interests of this time. And it really takes about 30 years of constant wrangling and fighting before you start to get progressive reforms at the beginning of the 20th century. And it takes a long time. So one way of thinking about it is to ask yourself where we are in history. How long have these companies been behemoths? The answer is not very long. Facebook only really figures out its surveillance capitalism model around 2008, and it doesn't really start to get humongous until 2010. So we're only a decade into this world. Politics is often chaotic. People often don't understand what's going on, and it usually takes democracies a pretty long time to figure out how to solve these problems. We're really in the infancy of these fights over the second Gilded Age. It's important not to lose hope. It's important to understand that we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble, but it's also important not to lose hope and to understand that eventually democratic systems can solve these kinds of problems. That is, by the way, not to suggest that they'll always pick the best solution. They often don't.
Can I add to that just a more practical question about the seemingly widespread public misunderstanding about the basic operation of the First Amendment? So, last year, a federal appellate court said that it was a violation of the First Amendment for President Trump himself to block his critics from following his Twitter account, which had become a designated public forum. And now we have scholars and commentators expressing significant concerns about the First Amendment implications of any increased regulation of Twitter that the president has already sort of openly announced would be in retaliation for the exercise of its free speech or editorial judgment. So we have this series of data points suggesting that Trump as a state actor might be flouting the First Amendment in his Twitter-related behaviors, violating either the First Amendment rights of other users or the First Amendment rights of Twitter itself. But we see that his own language and a huge amount of commentary from his supporters is couched in terms of these accusations that Twitter itself somehow, a non-governmental actor, is violating the First Amendment. And I just wonder, does this matter, right? Does the widespread public understanding of constitutional norms and boundaries make a difference for freedom of speech and press and these wider themes that we've been discussing as a group? Or, conversely, is there a reason to believe that these gross misunderstandings about how constitutional doctrines and constitutional freedoms operate have any concrete costs in the operation of democracy and the solutions that we're trying to explore here?
Good. This takes us circle back to where we started. Here's a way of putting it. I teach a course on the First Amendment. I tell my students, this is a course on First Amendment and free speech. They're not the same thing. Or they're not the same thing anymore. It's a real problem, a real issue in the 21st century. Trump, when Trump uses a technology in order to create a public forum, it doesn't matter that the technology he uses is privately owned, it's that he's using it. So that's what that Second Circuit case is about. When a government actor uses a technology to create a forum, then they are treated as a government actor regulating speech. On the other hand, Twitter and Facebook are engaged in, as I said, their social function is the organization, curation, and facilitation of public discussion. That means they are First Amendment actors. They are not First Amendment actors in the same way newspapers are, but they are First Amendment actors of a certain form. So they will have First Amendment rights, and attempts to try to interfere with their curation, facilitation, and organization of public discourse will have to meet First Amendment standards. Okay, very important. My view, however, is that they play a different role in the digital public sphere than broadband companies do. Broadband companies, on the other hand, are much more like the telephone companies used to be. That is, their job is just to get the bits from flowing from one place to another. The domain name system, that's its job. Get people to find the website so they can use them. Lots of other parts lower down on the stack, if you will, of the digital public sphere. Those are basically just basic services, and they should be treated in the same way we treat telephone companies, a little differently, but that's the basic idea. On the other hand, when you get higher up in the stack, when we get to the curators, the people who organize discourse, they're playing a really important role, First Amendment role, so they should have First Amendment rights. And a lot of people aren't willing to accept that. But here's the next point, and this is the point people find confusing. The political value of freedom of expression is larger than what the First Amendment in the American Constitution protects. That is, in lots of private spaces, in lots of private organizations, we have a political norm of free expression, of people being able to discuss and exchange ideas. And that political norm can exist even if the space created is a private space. That's true in universities, for example. We have norms of free expression that apply even if a university is nominally private, right? And in families too, and in friendships, and in all sorts of things that are private, we have a political ideal of free expression. So the basic challenge of the 21st century is how to protect that political ideal of free expression in a world in which the most important players are private actors and not states. People want to solve this problem by turning the private actors into states, by making them arms of the state, or by basically subjecting them to state regulation so they'll behave like states. But that's a mistake. That's not our world. Our world is triangular, I like to say, in which we have speakers, we have states, and we have these private infrastructure owners. And free speech is secured by protecting us both against the states and against the private infrastructure owners, and also making sure that the states don't try to use the private infrastructure owners to abridge our free speech rights. So it's kind of a multiplayer world we're in now. That's the most difficult thing for people to understand, but it's the most important thing for them to understand.
Scott, did you have a follow-up?
Well, I was curious as to whether you thought that this debate is, in some sense, misdirection. That is, we're talking about social media and being deplatformed on social media as if you could get on the op-ed page in the New York Times, or you could say whatever you wanted on broadcast television. On the one hand, I mean, that is, you have all these other forms of media of which most of us have absolutely no access to. And nobody seems to be particularly concerned about that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we're so worried about misinformation on social media platforms, when you could very well say, if you're on the left or the center, you say Fox News is one gigantic disinformation, misinformation network. And if you were on the right, you would say the same thing about the New York Times or CNN. So the question is are we talking about something that in the scale of things is like a minor problem, and the major problem is elsewhere, but that's too big. We can't even discuss it because it's too dangerous.
There are two problems, you're right, Scott, and they have to be separated out. One is the problem of propaganda, the general problem of propaganda and misinformation. In this this concern, the social media companies are part of the story, but they're not the central part of the story necessarily. The central part of the story has to do with polarization in American politics and with the rise of conservative counter-institutions, and also Fox News. This is Yochai Benkler's book, Network Propaganda, in which he points out that if you don't have Fox News and you don't have the conservative counter-institutions, you would have a very different structure of American public discourse, that they basically contributed to the problem. The different issue, though, is the issue of deplatforming. This is what I mean by this. It's true, nobody expected they had a right always to be able to talk on the New York Times letters to the editor. Nobody thought they had a right to talk on NBC all the time. But that's because what these media were largely producers of their own content, that is to say, right? Or with their contractual partners. What happened in the 21st century is we get these new institutions of public discourse. They're curators, organizers, and facilitators. So because that's their function, people reliably or rightly think that they should have access to them in a way that's different than a newspaper or NBC or a cable station. They think that they should have access, but you have to allow these spaces to govern themselves, otherwise they'll be useless for everyone. And so the real problem turns out to be different than the First Amendment and free speech. It turns out to be something like due process. That is, what you really need is fairness, transparency, procedural regularity, right? Respect for people as individuals when you make these kinds of decisions. That's in some sense more important now when we move to these private governors of these spaces than what we expected of states. We required all those things of states, but we also added First Amendment norms on top of it. And so so deplatforming kind of has to happen if you're going to have moderation. If you have moderation and you can't kick people off, you can't kick off content, you can't slow things down, then moderation is basically empty. It's toothless. But yeah, I just want to say there's one more thing. It's not just deplatforming or not. There's so many different tools in the toolkit. When you're thinking about content moderation, there's so many different ways you could moderate. You can slow things down. You can make them non-viral. You can make it more difficult for people to retweet. You can knock a particular thing off. You can knock some things off. You can give somebody a timeout for a week. So all the way to knocking them off. So moderation is a skill. It's an art, and it's something that these firms are learning how to do. They don't already know how to do it. They're trying to figure out how to do it. They're getting, criticized from all different angles as they're doing it. But this actually is a kind of set of professional norms that's being developed in real time.
Presumably,
Jack, isn't part of the problem that of the platforms are making, that they have billed themselves, as you I think know, as being a place for wide open, pretty much unregulated speech, Twitter in particular. But I mean, there was a time when we thought of Facebook as the walled garden, but even with respect to Facebook, isn't the question of their stepping back and providing much greater transparency, which in truth I think is where your due process largely going, a way of reacquainting the American public that uses the platform with the realities. I mean, aren't we seeing the slamming of the reality of the platforms with the reality they tried to create in their users as what they were up to?
They do tend to talk out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they do promise facilitation, participation, the ability to talk to anyone, anywhere in the world at any time. But at the same time, they promise safety, integrity, reliability, and protecting people from harm. Right? You can't, in order to realize those two sets of goals, you have to engage in content moderation. And once you engage in content moderation, you are going to be blamed for no longer being neutral. But most people do not want a Facebook that is basically flooded with pornography. They just don't. Some people do, but most people don't. Facebook has to make a decision. Do we have a rule against pornography? Yes, they do. In fact, they have a rule against nudity. The First Amendment allows people to make all sorts of kinds of arguments for violence all the time. Facebook has decided, well, do we want to allow that, or we want to restrict the kinds of advocacy of violence that states wouldn't be allowed to restrict? And they've decided they do. They do want to restrict much more than the First Amendment would ever allow a state to do. They restrict commercial speech much more than a state would ever be allowed to do. That's part of their job as moderators. That's what they have to do. That comes with the territory. You cannot say that you're doing that at the same time saying that you're being neutral, or say at the same time that everybody gets to participate on their own terms, anytime and under what circumstances they want. It's just not how it works in the 21st century. That's why, to go back to a point I've been harping, really important not to have just one company, because otherwise they will impose particular substantive values on everyone on the planet, and that would be bad.
Scott, Sandy, any final thoughts?
I think it's going to be a very, very interesting discussion that is going to take place in the not too distant future about something we talked about and then moved past, which is Section 230, and the question of immunity for platforms for their third party, their user material. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that the platforms were considered to be politically untouchable with respect to that immunity.
Right.
And I think that the tide may have changed somewhat. And I think it's going to behoove people who think very thoughtfully about this, like you, Jack, and Scott, and RonNell, to think about where Section 230 should go in order to promote the public sphere, the public forums that we actually want to have as a society. And I think that's going to be the big conversation, not tomorrow, but when the pandemic ends and we will begin to turn back to the realities of daily life.
Yeah, Jack, do you want to sort of lead us out with getting out your crystal ball? Do you dare engage in some fortune telling for the future about what's next?
Yeah, I will give you some fortune telling, but I'll give you some fortune telling, but I hope we'll go back to the question of the press and saving the press. But I have some things to chew on. One is, we're talking primarily about the United States in this discussion, but the actual governance of social media is global. And Facebook's a global company, Twitter's a global company, and it's likely that the next move will not come from the United States. Just as with privacy, the GDPR, America's still catching up. Europe came up with the GDPR. Europe is going to probably take the lead on the regulation of social media. They already have to a certain degree. Some of their decisions, I think, are wrong, are bad ideas, but they're going to come up with much more comprehensive regulation of digital platforms in the next couple of years. Very important to understand, and that the Americans will be, once again, following behind, trying to figure out what to do. European regulations will in turn have ripple effects and other effects on what Americans see and what they're able to do in these platforms. That's the first point. The second point is that it's really important when we focus on content moderation and the debates over the president and his Twitter feed to look away from that for a while and think about business models and how these business models are essentially draining the life out of the press. That is, the duopoly that Google and Facebook has over digital advertising is slowly strangling the provision of journalism, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. And that if we spend all our time fighting about content moderation, we will take our eyes off the much more important question, which is one of the reasons why we started this series, which is how to make sure that reliable, accurate, trustworthy, professional journalism can continue to exist in the digital world. That's really the question.
And in your view, is this social media regulation piece of the puzzle, this question of how to deal with these entities that are so powerful and so central to our everyday conversations on matters of public concern, but who are engaging almost exclusively in repeatage rather than reportage. Is that going to be central to this conversation? Is it going to drive the train?
It's the most salient to most people, but there are ways of basically connecting the fight over content moderation to the survival of journalism, but they all have to do with things like competition policy. They all have to do with things like changing the structure of businesses. So it's really important that politicians not focus on the bright, shiny object of disputes over content moderation and try to think about the deeper issues.
Well, thanks, Jack, for getting us together to talk about the more important issues of the day that are brought to the forefront in some of the president's most recent actions, and for giving us the chance to think about some of these wider themes in ways that are, I think, going to drive our conversation for a long time to come. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.